Hello, welcome to A Teacher's History of the United States. Thanks so much for joining us again today. Did you know that following the Boston Tea Party, Lord North spoke to Parliament and King George III and told them to draw a line in the sand and do something to the colonists, or else?
Did you know that for all of the backlash the colonies endured, there was a silver lining from the Boston Tea Parties? The colonies were free of Governor Hutchinson.
And that the port of Boston was totally shut down to the point that hay could not even be brought in for the horses.
And did you know that tarring and feathering, a relic of the Middle Ages, was brought back in vogue during the Revolutionary period?
Did you know all of this? Maybe. Maybe not. Today we will cover that and more in episode 47, The Intolerable Acts.
A proportional response? Question mark?
Nice. All right, welcome back into another episode of A Teacher's History of the United States. Bill is back with me again today. Lucky listeners, 2 weeks in a row. And Bill and I just enjoyed our weekend in the great city of brotherly love in Philadelphia. It was awesome. We got to meet up with a couple listeners, went to the Museum of the American Revolution, Valley Forge, the Constitution Center, Independence Hall, saw the Liberty Bell, which we'd seen before, which is just as unexciting as it was the first couple times, but it was really an awesome time. It was great to meet some of the listeners, talk history and podcasting, and of course, like NBA and MLB, because we're huge sports fans, and we just had a great time. Right, Bill? What do you think?
Saw some sights, ate some cheesesteaks. I'd say good time had by all.
Yeah, so just a reminder, episode 50 is a quasi-relaunch for us here at A Teacher's History. We are going back to weekly episodes. We are going to be much more active online, seeking your feedback, and of course, making sure that we show the appreciation that we do have for you. Because without listeners, well, I mean, we'd probably still be talking about history, but then nobody would be listening to us, which would sort of destroy the whole purpose of all the planning and scripting and editing and everything else. So thank you very much for that. Next episode, we'll be giving away some bobbleheads to a couple lucky winners. We've gotten quite a few people who have gone to the website and filled out the form on the website, so please continue to do that. And we will announce those next episode. Additionally, episode 50, this is an exciting announcement. If you go onto the website, you will see a form on the website. And right now, as I speak, the form is just to fill out your first name, last name, and email address for the bobblehead giveaway. But I will change that. And by the time you hear this, there will also be a box for you to write bobblehead or podcast. Because episode 50, really exciting one. Myself, Bill, and Zach are going to do a Q&A. We will answer your questions that you have for us, and we are going to invite a listener on to guest host it with us, and they can be the host and they can ask the questions. That will come out on July 4th, Independence Day, for those of you out there who do not know that, and that will be sort of the official quasi-relaunch of the podcast, and it's really, really exciting for us, for sure. Yeah, I've said really quite a few times, but that shows how excited I am. Anything to add here, Bill?
I'd just say that if Zach ever comes back on the pod, he can express his gratitude to all the listeners personally. But until that happens, I will thank the listeners for him. So thank you again on behalf of both myself and Zach, the extra credit contributors.
Yes. Zach is still gallivanting somewhere in Spain. I know he was also going to Mexico, and he's a rock climber, so he's climbing mountains all over the place. So he has been having a lot more fun than us. But please do remember to head to the website, type in your name, email, and whether or not you'd like to participate in the bobblehead giveaway or the guest hosting opportunity. It should be a great time. So, some things to review from last episode. We talked about the reaction to the Boston Tea Party, how some colonists actually were not on board with the Boston Tea Party and thought that it went a bit too far, and how furious men like Thomas Hutchinson were and other loyalists in Boston and throughout the colonies, and just how angry, which we'll get more into today, members of Parliament were. And we also covered the facts of the events. It was far more organized than most people gave or give the colonists credit for. The leaders of the Sons of Liberty stayed back in order to create some aspect of plausible deniability. Thomas Hutchinson couldn't really arrest anyone or do anything productive following the Boston Tea Party. And overall, there are going to be many colonists who support it, many who are against it, and very few in Parliament who are anything but furious. And when discussing, when news had gotten back to London about the Boston Tea Party, King George III was absolutely furious. And I believe, Bill, did he refer to the crossing, that this action was like equivalent to the crossing of the Rubicon, correct?
So King George, after learning of the events, the Boston Tea Party events, was quoted as saying, "The die is now cast. The colonies must either submit or triumph."
Yeah, and when we say the die is cast, Bill, putting you on the spot here, this is world history, not U.S. history, but I know you can get it. What are we referencing?
Yes, that is in reference to Julius Caesar crossing into Rome, 49 BC-ish, to take on Pompey's forces.
Yes, very good. The only thing I would correct is that it happened in 49 BC, not 49 BC-ish, but that's neither here nor there. So King George felt like this was the point of no return.
The game is afoot, as Sherlock Holmes would say.
Yes, very good. The great philosopher Sherlock Holmes, of course. Because once Caesar had taken his 13th legion across the Rubicon and entered Rome proper, there was no turning back. He had crossed the point of no return. He had taken his army into a place he was forbidden to march a Roman army into. And once he had done that, you can't, once you've ripped the Band-Aid off, it's a bit too late. And Bill, you have sources from Boston following the Tea Party also, correct, that you wanted to cover?
That's right, and it was decidedly different than King George's take. But in the Boston Gazette, the Boston Gazette on December 20th, so just a few days after the events of the Boston Tea Party, they wrote, "The people, finding all their efforts to preserve the property of the East India Company and return it safely to London, frustrated by the sea consignees, the collector of the customs, and the governor of the province, dissolved their meeting," in reference to one of the meetings of the Sons of Liberty. But they continue to write, "But behold what followed. A number of brave and resolute men determined to do all in their power to save their country from the ruin which their enemies had plotted. In less than 4 hours, emptied every chest of tea on board the 3 ships commanded by the captains Hall, Bruce, and Coffin, accounting to 342 chests, into the sea, without the least damage done to the ships or any other property. The matters and owners are well pleased that their ships are thus cleared, and the people are almost universally congratulating each other on this happy event." That was the Boston Gazette in December.
Yeah, I mean, good thing it wasn't hyperbolic at all.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, we can see the contrast between King George III's reaction and the Bostonians' reaction. Lord North then followed this up and said to King George III and Parliament, "The Americans have tarred and feathered your subjects, plundered your merchants, burnt your ships, denied all obedience to your laws and authority. Yet so clement and so long forbearing has our conduct been that it is incumbent on us now to take a different course. Whatever may be the consequences, we must risk something. If we do not, all is over. Basically, according to Lord North, it was their opportunity to show the colonies who was boss. I mean, he made it very black and white. They're either controlled by the colonies or they control the colonies, and there really would be no in between. Many of the officials at Parliament at this time were concerned that the colonists were too comfortable and felt as though they were acting like they could basically get away with anything. You know, something like dumping thousands of pounds of private property into the Boston harbor. The East India Company met with British officials to determine the next steps. How were they going to get paid back? What should they do with future tea that was rejected? There's a lot more tea on the way and planned to go over to the colonies. What do they do with it? Well, I'll get into how they plan on being reimbursed in a few minutes, but they weren't as concerned with rejected tea because they figured if they got some tea rejected, they could send it up to Halifax, where people would buy it and then distribute it to the other colonies. So instead, they turned their focus on Boston, and they wanted to punish them. Some in London claimed that these actions could very well be considered treason, and the heavy hand of justice had to be pounded down on the colonists of Boston. Oh, and one more thing, not to mention, keep in mind, there were members of Parliament here, and we mentioned this in previous episodes, that they had actually invested in the East India Company. So they were personally and financially involved in this. So they decided to pass the Coercive Acts of 1774, also known as the Intolerable Acts by the British colonists. Bill, what were the primary purposes of these acts?
We should first readdress the goals of the Intolerable Acts, and they were known as the Intolerable Acts in the colonies. Obviously, like you said, Chris, goal number one, first and foremost, this was aimed directly at the revolution hotbed of Boston. And second, these were intended to be punitive, purely punitive. So
yeah, some of them were clearly not regulatory, but instead very punitive.
And so, before we get into the acts themselves, I'm reminded you were a fan of the television show The West Wing, correct, Chris?
Yes, I absolutely love it. Loved almost every second of it. President Bartlett is the man.
My revisiting of the Intolerable Acts, the response of Parliament, the response of the King, Lord North, all of it reminded me of that episode of The West Wing when they deal with what is a proportional response. And it's what role or responsibility does the superpower have to those countries, whether they are colonies or other independent nations? What is the relationship that they have? What roles and responsibilities do they have to one another when it comes to a formal response, whether it be an act, a military act, a diplomatic act? What are the roles there? And of course, my mind was taken to the memorable scene where the Chief of Staff Leo goes back and forth with President Bartlett about, you have to be measured, you have to be just, you have to be merciful. And of course, Bartlett, who's very he's very mad, he's upset, he's emotional.
Yeah,
he
was for sure an emotional character.
Yeah, and he was like, no, we have to even the playing field. We have to go eye for an eye. And I think in my revisiting of all of these events, I'm reminded of that mentality. Parliament acting in a purely punitive manner as the superpower in this scenario, they levy these purely punitive, crushing acts that just are intended to break the spirit of the people of Boston and the people of Massachusetts. But in fact, it works the opposite way. So I keep coming back to this notion of a proportional response. And if the British Parliament and Lord North and the King had any notion of that, but like you said, Chris, there were so many interests at play, especially moneyed interests. And when money is at play, I think people act a little nutty sometimes. So obviously, we got into what is right or what is wrong last episode.
Bill, I'd like to play devil's advocate a little bit here, and I love to do that. So these acts were far too punitive. They were over the top. Parliament once again underestimated how much of their reaction would galvanize the colonists. I mean, okay, so let's take a look at the actions, things that have actually happened. The Tea Party, the Gaspee Affair, the Boston Massacre, the Stamp Act riots, the non-importation agreements, the protest against the Townshend Act. These actions by the colonists didn't really galvanize the colonists on like a macro level. It was always the response from Parliament that did the galvanizing of the colonists. And from Parliament's perspective, I get it. For years now, the colonists have been publicly speaking out against the king. You have all of these events that I just mentioned, the Boston Massacre, the Tea Party, the boycotting, the Stamp Act riots, people protesting the Townshend Acts, the Gaspee Affair, all of this stuff going on. And the whole time, London did not do any of the following, okay? So just listen to this. They did not suspend local assemblies. They did not shut down newspapers. They did not take over local government. They did not arrest the rebel leaders. They did not practice any type of mass incarceration at all. So I can understand why Parliament was frustrated by this. They had tried to give, at least in their mind, measured responses. They had tried to give them the benefit of the doubt, right? They had been existing in a colonial economy for over centuries at this point. The American colonists are the first ones throwing a huge fit over this that Parliament really can't seem to get a handle on. But I get it. I can see why some members of Parliament genuinely believed they had done enough for the colonists up to this point, and the issue truly was with a small group of colonial rebels in Boston. I mean, as much as I love the Patriots, not the football team, I hate them, but the patriotic colonists of the 18th century, they sort of brought this on themselves, couldn't you say?
I can respect that argument. I never knew you were such a Tory, unless this is truly a.
I mean,
a
I love to look at things from both sides. It drives me crazy
wait
when
a second.
the other side's perspective is not even considered.
Yeah, but
I don't get my emotional needs met in creating political agendas. It doesn't happen with me.
But yeah, I think the one thing you're missing out on, though, through your litany of grievances that the Parliament might have had did have, you're completely ignoring the fact that the Parliament never addressed the colonists' primary complaint, and that is the lack of representation and their inability or their ability to tax the American colonies without any representation whatsoever. Without addressing that primary complaint, everything else just fell to the wayside. Yes, those were legitimate complaints that the colonists had: the Stamp Act, the sugar tax, the Boston Massacre. All of these things touched on hot button issues for the colonists, but the Parliament never actually addressed their number one issue. And so I think I think you can rationalize Parliament's actions, but if they were actually, and this is what I was saying last episode, if they actually had an accurate pulse of the people, they would have understood that there were bigger issues at play. There was a larger, really esoteric issue. There's something ephemeral almost in the air, and it wasn't just we thought we were paying too much for tea, so oh great, the people will be mollified if we charge less for tea. It wasn't about that. It was about their ability to self-govern. It was about their ability to of self-determination that the Parliament was really suffocating. And that is something the Parliament never actually addressed, and in fact doubled down on their draconian efforts with the Intolerable Acts.
Yeah, and of course I do agree with that and think that Parliament often thought micro while the colonists were thinking macro. And Bill, you and I talk about this offline all the time, that the rebel colonists seem to have a much larger vision of where the future of the relationship was going than members of Parliament often did.
Yeah, I think it's a good argument to make, because I do think, if you're trying to get into the other side's shoes, you've got to be able to think and give their side legitimacy for a moment. Okay. Yeah,
for sure. Or else you don't understand the logic or the nuance behind it.
Correct. Okay.
So, yeah. Anyway, let's dive into it. March 1774, the Boston Port Act was passed in response to the Boston Tea Party. And Bill, what did this bill say?
Boston Port Bill passed March 31st of 74. This closed the Boston port until the destruction of the king's property was paid for. Only food and firewood were allowed in. What was the underlying principle here? Financial hardship. And then lastly, this was a concerted effort to punish all those in Massachusetts, not just Boston, as many of the goods came through the Boston port.
Yes, and this is infuriating the colonists because many of them are now being punished for the crimes of a few, right? It makes sense why they would be angry. Now, the next act that is passed is the Administration of Justice Act, or the Murder Act. This said that the governor of Massachusetts could now transfer any government official or soldier accused of any capital crime to another colony or all the way back to England. So, Bill, let's sort of connect the dots here, especially in Boston. Why is this so insulting to the colonists?
Well, think about this. I mean, just 4 years earlier, in 1770, John Adams proved that British soldiers could get a fair shake in Boston, Massachusetts. And now all of a sudden, they're removing the goodwill isn't going both ways, essentially. The crown can now venue shop for what's going to be favorable to them.
Exactly. The first time I read this, I thought of the trials. Anyway, so the third and fourth acts, the Massachusetts Government Act, it changed the charter of the Massachusetts colony. The council was then to be appointed by the crown as opposed to the colonist. Also, all town meetings were going to require the governor's permission. And then the Quartering Act. If a colonial town did not provide barracks to British troops in 24 hours, they now could stay in basically any uninhabited building whenever they wanted.
So, Chris, on the Quartering Act, this is the Quartering Act of 1774, part of the Intolerable Acts. But if you'll remember, there was also a Quartering Act of 1765. So there was a legacy of British troops being in the people's business, so to speak. But in 1774, like you just said, all of a sudden, they could just take up quarter in a private residence, in a private building. Doesn't seem right, does it? And then also on the Massachusetts Government Act, I think for a number of years now, there's been one constant thorn in the colonist side. And that was one Governor Hutchinson. And that dude, for all his loyalty to the crown, was promptly removed from office in favor of General Thomas Gage. So if there was one silver lining through all of this, the colonists did get to rid themselves of Governor Hutchinson, who they hated.
Yes, they did. And man, it must have been awkward for Hutchinson and Gage. After they passed the Intolerable Acts, they knew they were going to need someone a bit tougher on the colonists to execute all of these things, and General Gage, in their mind, was the man to do it. So, real quick background on Gage. He joined the army at the age of 20, came over to the colonies and fought with Braddock and Amherst in the French Indian War, and married a colonist from New Jersey. He had been spending the last decade in New York City as a commander and had been actually back in England for a brief period during the Tea Party. And he was a guy who was very supportive of the coercive or the Intolerable Acts. So it seemed to be a perfect fit for him to go back to the colonies and to put these colonists in their place. In April 1774, Gage returned to the colonies, and he looked forward to exerting his newfound authority. He arrived, probably awkwardly, gave Hutchinson the bad news, told him that he was likely only going to be temporary governor, so don't worry, Thomas, you'll surely get your post back. Hutchinson, not surprisingly, was pretty taken aback by this news, and on June 1st, he took a ship back to London with his family.
And lastly, the fifth component to the Intolerable Acts was the Quebec Act, June 22nd of 74. And this extended territorial lines. Why that's important is because colonists were starting to think about moving west. And this, the extension of territorial lines were an explicit stop to American colonial expansion claims. It also passed religious reforms favorable only to Catholics. And so this was sort of an indirect warning shot to all of the American colonies. While the first four were really aimed square in the eyes of the people of Boston and Massachusetts, the Quebec Act was really aimed at those middle colonies and the southern colonies. That this was a warning that this was the new normal for colonial administration.
Yeah, and Bill, I think it's also very important to add, and we have the benefit of hindsight here, but we will talk about at the very beginning of the Revolution, there will be an expedition into southeastern Canada right at the beginning of the war. Two famous colonial generals, Horatio Gates and Benedict Arnold, will make an attempt at taking parts of Canada. And they assumed that most of the Canadians, the French Canadians, would side with them against the British. But this Quebec Act is really important because what many of these Canadians recognized was that the British, through the Quebec Act, were pretty much giving them freedom to practice their faith freely. And they were French Catholics. And the colonists were devout, many of them, devout Protestants. And so many of the French were not totally on board with supporting the colonists in this revolution, at least the French in Canada, because they were afraid it might infringe upon their freedom to practice their religion, unmolested. So that's an important point to make.
But I do want to say something about the Intolerable Acts collectively, and we're looking forward, but I'll be brief. And it's as we were going through what each Intolerable Act restricted or took away. Think about this. Chris mentioned that their town meetings were restricted. Free assembly ring a bell? The Quartering Act. Does the Fourth Amendment come to mind? A government passing laws to directly benefit and overtly benefit a particular religion over others. Does that ring a bell? I think if you want to start taking a look at the list of grievances and how it works its way into our founding documents, I think this is a great place to start.
Yeah, I would agree with that. You also mentioned the Quartering Act, which is the Third Amendment. And hold on, let me see if I can remember it. It states, no soldier shall, in time of peace, be quartered in any house without the consent of the owner, nor in time of war, but in a manner to be prescribed by law. Boom. I feel extremely nerdy that I just said that off the top of my head. And I'm like 99% sure, Bill, that is verbatim accurate. A little embarrassing. I didn't get out a lot as a young child. So, yeah. Anyway, Sam Adams, through the Committee of Correspondence, reached out to other colonists to see if they would join Massachusetts in solidarity after the coercive acts had come in, or the Intolerable Acts. I know I mix them up often, but you get the gist. And actually, they got at least one taker. Virginia joined Massachusetts, and they actually had a day of fasting. Bill, did you know that?
I did not know that, but that is not my style.
Yeah, not my style either. I mean, we have 5 different cheesesteaks in our 48 hours in Philly. In addition to that, Thomas Jefferson, a well-known Virginian, wrote a pamphlet in which he crushed King George III and said that Parliament was limited in their abilities to pass laws on the colonies and that it was unjust for them to do this to the colonists. So when we think about this reaction to the Intolerable Acts, as we mentioned earlier, Gage had arrived in Boston to give Hutchinson his walking papers. And at first, the people of Boston didn't quite know what to make of Gage, but they hated Hutchinson, so this guy can't be that bad, right? But they found out really quickly that yes, he was that bad. and they are going to not like him, and he is not even going to be remotely amenable to their colonial desires. As the news of the Intolerable Acts began to roll in, many colonists felt like London at this point had gone above and beyond what was necessary and forced the colonists to more or less pick a side, loyalty or revolution. So many of the more moderate colonists, men like we've mentioned, George Washington, Ben Franklin, etc., now were siding with the revolutionary cause, even if they initially did not approve of the Boston Tea Party or some of the other radical actions of the Bostonians. And Bill, this is something you mentioned in your last episode with Franklin and Washington, not actually approving of the Boston Tea Party. And one last thing that's curious. While the Port Act said the port would be closed until the tea was paid back, technically, General Gage didn't really let that happen. Some of the merchants in Boston actually offered to pay for the tea, and he did not let them. He didn't want a few people to buy off the rest of the colony. He never gave a direct explanation, but that is what can likely be assumed. And we're not going to get into it today, Bill. I'll cover it in more detail next week. But what is it that the colonists do to create a thoughtful response to all of this?
So, great question, Chris. You would think when people are pushed that far, they're going to respond eventually. You mentioned the committees of correspondence, making sure everyone's on the same page in terms of the information available. Newspapers start turning on this British tyranny. The colonists start sending supplies and aid to Boston, which could be construed as the first step in the unification of the 13 colonies. It created sympathy among the colonies for Massachusetts generally, because the Intolerable Acts were overly broad, restricted their rights. Now, what does this all culminate in? Well, on September 5th, 1774, the First Continental Congress, where 12 colonies came together to talk about their list of grievances. Now, we're not going to get into that First Continental Congress today, but I did want to make a point of noting it for the listeners, that in the future, and in an upcoming episode, we'll address it, that the colonists did come together for a formal response to the Crown.
As Bill mentioned, this is something that I'll talk about in more detail next episode, which is an episode I'm really excited for. Now, Bill, I'd like to pivot just a little bit, well, I guess a lot of it, and talk about a very specific topic that you and I have been kicking around. So when people take in information about the Revolutionary period, they usually see, hear, or read about the practice of tar and feathering. This became fairly common in the colonies, and at times can be misunderstood. So I figured this could be a good time to dive into just a bit more detail about it.
Yeah, I mean, Chris, we talked about it around the Boston Massacre, the HBO miniseries John Adams. And if you're familiar with that, there is a scene, and HBO and the writers make it conflate events, as dramatic license often does. They depict the scene of one of the customs officers in Boston being tarred and feathered.
Yeah, he was in an argument with John Hancock, correct?
Yeah. He calls Hancock a smuggler, and Hancock
yes, he was
responds, "Watch your tongue, sir." But it's very saucy stuff. But yeah, he gets in an argument with John Hancock, who, granted, had an extremely large interest in the smuggling of tea. So technically, he was the British customs officer was right. But yeah, so the reaction to that, though, and this in the HBO miniseries, this is before the Boston Tea Party, but the reaction to this British customs officer in front of Sam Adams, in front of John Adams, in front of John Hancock, is that they tar and feather this guy. And I got to tell you, I didn't realize this was really that widespread. And honestly, based on my research, it wasn't rampant, but it certainly happened on more than a handful of occasions, and certainly more than I would have thought. would have happened. But there is one thing that I think should be noted, because I had no idea. The tar that they're referring to at this point in time was pine tar, not tar you would see commonly with like asphalt today.
Yeah, I mean, asphalt tar, I would think would be very deadly.
So I was thinking, like, how did anyone survive this? Like, that tar is like, I looked it up. Melting tar for asphalt's like 300 degrees Fahrenheit. Like, that's crazy. But this pine tar was, melting pine tar was about 140 degrees Fahrenheit. Still very hot, like hotter than bathwater or anything like that, but not nearly what tar for asphalt would be. So let's clear up that right off the bat.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you cleared that up. So let's put this into perspective. Real quick, Bill, because I just really want to pause here. 140 degree bathwater is insanely hot, right? 105 is when you dip your foot into the hot tub and you look at your buddy and say, dude, this water is really friggin' hot. 140 is scalding hot. So just a little bit more background. And you mentioned this in the teaser of the episode, Bill. Tar and feathering became popular in the colonies in the late 1760s, but it began in the Middle Ages. Usually it was done to a member of a group in order to embarrass or humiliate them. It had pretty much died out and was brought back during this time for two primary purposes. Number one, pine tar was often used to waterproof ships, so the harbors had them readily available. Feathers were also very available because they were used for pillows and cushions and such. So the two main ingredients, the tar and the feathers, were available in colonial port cities all the time. So Bill, how did this work? If someone was to be a victim of this process, what would they be experiencing?
Yeah, I'll describe that, and then I'll give you an example. So during the Revolutionary period in America, one would be tarred and feathered by removing all of one's garments above the waist. So you are shirtless for maximum tar coverage. And so they would pour the tar over your head. They would then throw the feathers on you, or in some instances, make you roll around in them, or force your body to roll around in them, because at that point you're kind of on fire because the tar is so hot. And then, if that wasn't humiliating enough, then they would parade you around and show you off to be the traitor and British loyalist that you were.
Yeah, I mean, it was just awful, just really terrible. And you may be assuming that the customs officials were the ones that were often the victims, but it was actually most commonly the men who would rat out the smugglers or offer information.
Right. And so why...
Snitches get stitches, as we say here in Baltimore.
It's Baltimore. And so that really gets to the intent behind the Tarring and Feathering Act. You could view it as humiliation. You could view it as torture, frankly. Or you could view it as pure intimidation.
Yeah, I mean, this is political intimidation 101.
And and so I think what the John Adams miniseries was trying to highlight and dramatize is the act, the unsettling nature of the act, because it depicts Sam Adams as, kind of encouraging it, and John Adams really just giving it to Sam. Like, what are we doing here? This is it's barbarism is what he calls it. And it is actually disturbing to see, and the music swells, and you're like, oh my God, what are we doing here? But there is an example that I found in my research. What was deemed, at least in the articles that I was reading, as the most publicized event of tarring and feathering in the colonies was an attack on a British customs official. I do not mean to completely undermine your previous statement, Chris.
Yeah, I see what you're doing here.
About tarring and feathering being reserved for those snitches, but in this case, John Malcolm, who was a British customs official, was tarred and feathered by the Sons of Liberty, or by colonists, twice. Once, the first time, Mr. Malcolm was attacked in November of 73, but he walked away unscathed because he had all of his clothes still on. I guess that's fortunate for him. The second time Mr. Malcolm was tarred and feathered was in January 25th of 1774. Puts you about a month out from the Boston Tea Party. A mob punished him for attacking shoemaker George Hughes. That name sounds a little familiar. Well, it's because Mr. Hughes was a member of the Sons of Liberty and a participant in the Boston Tea Party. Well, Mr. Hughes was walking down a Boston street and discovered Mr. Malcolm allegedly threatening a young boy with his club. Words were exchanged, and ultimately Malcolm was hit over the head by the club and knocked unconscious. Well, Malcolm returned home, and then he discovered a large crowd outside of his home. And here's the truly interesting part about this example. Malcolm actually egged on the crowd to tar and feather him better than before, because the crowd was saying, "Oh, you've been tarred and feathered." Hughes even questioned his honor and his truthfulness because Hughes had mentioned to Malcolm that he had been tarred and feathered before. Malcolm taunted the crowd verbally with a sword and with pistols. And spoiler alert, they did tar and feather this guy, and tied him to a tree. So Malcolm got literally what he asked for when he was egging on the crowd. Not a tactic I think I would have employed, but this man was an interesting fellow.
Yeah, that is definitely a unique example. So the first reported colonist to be tarred and feathered was William Smith in Norfolk, Virginia in 1766. The Sons of Liberty, as we mentioned, began using it more and more, and they brought it back to the colonies in 1768, at least the New England area, and it happened all the way up until 1791 during the Whiskey Rebellion. And there are actually reports of it happening in America even up through the 20th century. So it was very common during the Revolutionary period and very effective at getting some of the less courageous colonists to fall in line and allow the rebellious ones to dominate local society and politics. As you pack up your things, I'd like you to consider where the colonists find themselves now and the competing emotions that are at play. Remember, all politics are local, and certainly it was no different here. As we get into the next 5 to 10 episodes and dive deeper into the outbreak of the revolution, it will be valuable to keep in mind that people do things for their own reasons, and there will be large pockets of colonists that reacted emotionally and selfishly to the Intolerable Acts. And remember that when I say selfishly, I mean in their family's own self-interest. And oftentimes in life, there's nothing wrong with that. Others will play the political game a bit less transparently, though, acting in their own self-interest but claiming that it is for some type of broader ideological goal. And then there will be my favorite group of people, a large group of colonists that act in the best interest of everyone involved to create their own nation, sacrificing their lives, their fortunes, and their future in order to try to create a better future and society for their children, grandchildren, and so on. And then there will be a large group of colonists that remain loyal to the king and parliament, whether it was for their own immediate interest or part of a broader belief in what they deem best for the future of the British colonies. Next episode, I will cover Ben Franklin and a little bit about his life, one of the great founding fathers and one of the most famous Americans ever to live and not ascend to the presidency. We'll discuss his experiences in London at this time, the colonists finally creating the first Continental Congress, and get us one step closer to the revolution. Bill, thanks for contributing. Listeners, thank you for listening. And hopefully now you can take pride in knowing just a little bit more about the history of the United States. Class dismissed. If you'd like to raise your hand, please feel free to reach out. Find us on Twitter at A Teacher's Hist, on Facebook, A Teacher's History Podcast. And I realized it at the beginning of the episode when I kept telling you to go to the website, sign up for the bobblehead giveaway, or to be a guest host on episode 50. I never mentioned the website. That is www.ateachershistory.com. See you next episode.